My name is Senor Verdaguer, Mr. Verdaguer. I teach Spanish. This is my third year at Catholic Memorial. I went to college here in Boston. I went to Boston College. I think the college search experience was a bit like walking in the dark for me. There were two things that I did know. The first thing that I knew was that I had to commute. I'm one of 7 kids. And my parents luckily offered to pay for undergraduate, but they asked all of us to make sure that we commuted so it would bring the cost of the university down. So keeping it local was one thing that I knew, and it wasn't my choice. The other thing that I knew was that I wanted to continue competing in athletics. In high school, I played soccer in the fall, I wrestled in the winter, and I ran track and field in the spring. And of the 3 sports, I had the most room for growth in track and field. I was the most successful and had the most potential to improve in track and field. So I was looking for a school where I can continue to do that, where I continue to run. So I applied to 6 local schools coming out of Newton South High School. My parents had not gone to college in the United States. They went to school in Argentina where I was born. So my older siblings, I have 3 older sisters, they went through the process, but none of them had been looking at the schools that I was looking at. So there were a lot of unknowns. I also didn't know what I wanted to study. I had some ideas, but I wasn't smitten by anything. There wasn't a particular subject area that I was really motivated by. It was mostly, my focus was on doing well in school, getting good grades, and just trying to do my very best on the field or on the track. When I got into the schools that I applied to, one of the first things I did was I went to their websites. Surprisingly, they had websites. The internet was a new thing at the time, but they had websites, and I checked out their college majors, and I wanted to make sure that I went to a school that had a lot of options for college so that I could have a lot of choices when I entered college, and I was able to make a choice that fitted my interests. The other connection that I had was my junior year of high school. My jumping coach, who was a BC alum, went over to BC to coach their team, and she invited me to come to BC to look at the team, and I liked what I saw. And so knowing that I had someone else on the other side who was interested in watching me grow as an athlete was a big draw. So essentially I was recruited to run track in college, but it was by somebody that I knew personally, so that kind of made the choice easy. I think those were the main factors that brought me to BC. In retrospect, I do wish I would have done a little bit more research in advance or had developed a better plan. I think it would have made the process of choosing a major in college perhaps a little bit easier. As I mentioned, I commuted to BC all 4 years, but I was hyper involved, perhaps too involved. In fact, by the time I got to my senior year, I had to cut down on a bunch of student activities, not because they were necessarily negatively affecting my grades. I kept good grades in college, but I was really hungry to do academics and only academics my senior year. In fact, I really wanted to get a 4.0. I was very determined to get a perfect grade, and I just missed it by an A-. So what stands out for me as most memorable would have to be the conversations that I had my first and second year of college about what major I wanted to choose. And one of the conversations that I had was with my first year freshman writing seminar teacher. I remember going down to the basement of this building in BC where her office was, and trying to decide whether I wanted to go with something pragmatic like science or math, or if I was interested in the humanities. And I, in my heart, knew that I was more interested in the humanities, but part of me felt the outside pressure to pick something that was going to be lucrative in the long run. She encouraged me to follow my heart, and and I ended up falling in love with philosophy of all subjects, which doesn't pay anything. But it's a great field, and the fact that I chose something that I was motivated by for intrinsic reasons, I think took a lot of courage, and I'm glad that I did it. Philosophy, for me, meant that I could dive deep into the big questions about what is the good life, what makes a just society, what makes a good friend. All these kind of big questions that are part of making good choices in life. I was really kind of taken by those questions, and I also had really great professors that inspired me and helped me to grow. And besides talking to that professor, it was talking to my parents. I had just gone on a retreat at the end of sophomore year called Halftime, and it was about reflecting on the midpoint of college and trying to decide some of the big questions, particularly what major to choose, because you're required to choose one at the end of your sophomore year, and I chose philosophy. So I went home after that retreat determined to make that my choice, and I remember like asking my parents to come down to the living room so I could have this serious chat about what my major was going to be, and I thought I was going to break their hearts by telling them that I was not going to do pre-med, which I kind of wanted to do. And they were like, sure, that's fine. And what I thought was going to be like a super difficult conversation turned out to be just fine. They just cared to know that that I was following something that I really cared about. And I felt it was going to be a big conversation because they were paying for college. Like, I wanted to make sure that their money was well spent. And so I was afraid that by telling them I wanted to do philosophy, they were going to, tell me to go do economics or something else. So anyhow, economics doesn't pay either, by the way. So I chose philosophy, and they said it was fine, and it was great. My minor, though, in college was Hispanic studies. So I'm very happy that I kept up with my Spanish language studies because it's related to what I do now, and that does pay. So I'm glad that I kept with that. So I graduated from Boston College in 2003, and after that, I actually once again found myself not sure what to do. I got a job working at a hospital close to where I was living, and I worked the third shift of the emergency room admissions department. So I was taking in patients and families and recording their personal and insurance information at like 2 a.m. And it was a neighborhood of Massachusetts that actually has a good amount of crime. So I was seeing things that you see on television, people coming in with gunshot wounds, not all of them, but just those few that come, those stay with you, because it's not often that you see somebody with a gunshot wound. So I did that for a few months, and I continued soul searching. I went to Argentina, my native country, and I went there for a month. And I stayed with relatives, and I traveled around and sort of returned to kind of get to know my roots. And it was another memorable time in my life. A lot of lifelong memories came from that trip. And after that, I returned to the US, and I started working as an AmeriCorps Fellow. An AmeriCorps Fellow is somebody who works in the service of the community as a volunteer for a full year and sometimes 2 years. My program was a 1-year commitment. And I worked for what's called a CDC, a Community Development Corporation in Lawrence, Massachusetts. That CDC exposed me to community work. It exposed me to the betterment of society and how to get people in communities to connect, to knock on doors and build relationships, and all of that stuff fascinated me. I decided to go back to school mostly because I loved learning. So I went to NYU. I applied to several schools, and NYU was the one that gave me a very good financial package. So I went to NYU because of that reason, even though I had gotten into some Ivy League schools, and I wanted to follow that because of the reputation of going to an Ivy, but it turned out to make the most sense. I got a master's in public administration in 2 years. The MPA was a great a great master's, but knowing what I do now, a Spanish teacher, a lot of the skills that I acquired in my MPA, I don't directly use. So NYU, in many ways, was a great life experience, being in New York City, living on my own for the first time. In my 20s, there's no better place to be than New York. But I think it was somewhat premature because, as I mentioned, the skills that I was learning were not necessarily ones that I ended up applying. And I think if I could go back in time, I would wait a little bit longer to have been in the workforce, to have determined better what I wanted to do for a living before going back to school. But as I mentioned, no surprise, as a teacher, I love learning. I really love learning. I love being in the classroom, both to teach and to learn. And so it was hard to resist going back. And so for that reason, I don't regret it. My piece of advice for anyone who's thinking about what to do next for their life after CM, all of our students here, my advice to you comes from a quote that I ran across a few years ago by George Bernard Shaw that goes something like this: to be in hell is to drift, to be in heaven is to steer, meaning that if you sort of let life happen to you, it's going to be a lot more difficult, a lot more challenging to face the unknowns of life because you haven't taken the time to adequately prepare to make a good choice about what you want to do with your life. So my advice is to enter college with a plan. Apply to schools for whatever reason you want to apply to those schools, but then take the time to visit the websites, look at the majors, go beyond that. Look at the specific major that you're thinking of doing and check out the list of faculty in that department so that you can look at what they're studying, and from that perhaps you can find a common link so that when you enter campus in September or late August, you can go knowing that there's someone in the faculty that you think in the long run you might connect with, because that's what matters. When you're in higher ed, you're looking to make real, genuine connections with your professors because they will push you to follow your heart and to learn things that you're genuinely interested. You no longer are choosing courses necessarily because you're required to. You're choosing courses because they meet your desires, and that's a whole different ballgame. So you need to have a plan in order to do that well. There you go.
That's awesome.
Deuces.